Hopefully we had a good experience learning React. What we wrote was totally complete. I'm happy with that architecture, and I think you can scale that to, well, let me rephrase that. I have personally scaled that architecture to large applications. Now we're going to introduce you to another concept, which is Redux, right? Redux is not married to React at all. They're two totally separate libraries. It was birthed for sure in the Redux or in the React community, hence why it actually lives in the Reactjs repo. But it is totally acceptable to use Redux with Angular, with Ember, or by itself. Redux by itself is not a particularly verbose framework for storing data. There's actually a gist out there that you can write Redux in like 80 lines of code, like bare minimum. And like it's not like, you know, code golf or anything like that. It's actually just not, there's not a lot to Redux. That being said, it's hard, right? And like I just want to like emphasize, like throughout this entire course, if any of this feels like hard or like unapproachable or anything like that, it's because it is hard. Like we're learning some hard stuff here. All of this stuff is hard. So like I permiss you to feel like this is hard, right? Sometimes it's good just to acknowledge that like we're doing hard stuff together, right? That being said, we're about to do harder stuff together. Integrating React and Redux is going to make our architecture more complicated. And you'll see here, I want you to make your own judgment calls here, but it's going to make it overly complicated to the point that like what we're going to do is actually not worth it for this size of application. But again, like that's my opinion and I want you to make your own decision. But I don't integrate Redux until further along in the project lifecycle. I wait for Redux to become necessary before I integrate it, which is what I'm going to suggest to you as well. Redux was invented by Dan Abramov, really smart and nice guy. He based it on Facebook's Flux architecture and also a bit on Elm's architecture as well. So those kind of ideas combined in his mind because he wanted to write a data store that was hot reloadable, what we were just looking at, and he came up with Redux. Redux is really similar to Flux. A lot of you have probably heard of Flux before. That came out at the same time as React from Facebook as well. And Flux is a really interesting idea that you have data stores and you dispatch actions into the data stores which then modify themselves and then update whatever view layer, in this case React, is subscribed to it. The difference between Flux and Redux is with Flux you have many stores, right? You have, they're kind of like single concern stores. So like for example, you would have maybe a user store and then you'd have like a messages store and then you would have all these different kind of stores that worry about one particular thing. I attended a talk from a Facebook engineer that told me on their ads product, at its height, it had over 100 stores on the page. Now, as you may imagine, that's a nightmare, right? Trying to figure out what data goes into what store is, at least at that scale, unscalable. It became more complicated than it was worth. And so, and particularly, let's say we had an animation that we were animating a component across an entire page, right? That was almost impossible to do with Flux because you would have all these different stores that were asynchronously dispatching actions to each other and trying to coordinate that change across multiple stores. It's pretty much impossible. So Dan came up with this idea. It's like, well, we have this one application in React, right? And this React application is a tree of things, right? Well, why can't we have our data mimic the way that our views are stored, right? So why don't we have one tree of data? And that's how Redux was born. Instead of having instead of having many tiny stores, let's have one big store, but the big store is just a tree, and then each part of our application can just subscribe to one part of the tree, right? That's the basic gist. So, yeah, you're going to have one Redux store on a page. The top level function in a store in Redux is called a reducer, or a root reducer. You're going to hear the term reducer over and over and over again. And a reducer is just a function that takes in state and an action and gives you back a new state, right? So given this store in this particular state that it's in right now, and this action, this is the state that you get back out. This is really awesome because that means everything is reproducible, right? Given this state and this action, you get this new state, right? So it makes everything extremely testable at every single level. And we're actually going to do quite a bit of testing with Redux. One of the big strengths of Redux is it makes your state management very testable. So, and the way it addresses those kind of large changes where it changes multiple things, like that animation example that I previously gave, is you have access to all of the state all at once, right? You can modify multiple things at once. So if you have those massive changes that you need to make, go right ahead. You're welcome to do so. So this is kind of high level of what Redux is going to do for you. State management, right? It's a state management framework. So we're going to be taking things out of React, right? Right now, React is managing all of its state via its state, like this.state.whatever and this.setState. We're going to take that data out of React and we're going to stick it into Redux, right? So we're kind of divorcing our data from React. Now I'm going to assert to you, I think React does a really good job of managing state. However, you might get to a point, at some point, where you have tons of components all worried about the same state. And that's the point where you say, maybe I should use Redux now, right? Because imagine for a moment, let's say we had 10 different routes, right? Each of those routes was very complicated, had lots of components, and they were all interested about the shows that we were requesting from the API, right? Our two options here is that we can either put all of that data up into app.jsx and pass that down into every single route. That's very burdensome, right? Or we can have some sort of centralized state container like Redux that will take care of all that for us. Does that make sense?
When you say burdensome, you just mean from a development perspective, not from like performance or...
Yeah, development. From a like maintainability and things like that, right? Because what you're going to have is you're going to have these shows at the top level, and you're going to have to pass shows in every single component. So now every single component inside of your application cares about these shows, right? This becomes a real problem if I have top level app and bottom level component down here, and there's like 10 components here in the middle. There's going to have to be a bunch of components passing state from parent to child, parent to child, parent to child, till eventually it lands at the bottom, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have to have cared about that shows component, right? But it's just kind of tying your data into your application structure. We call this data tunneling, right? This alleviates the data tunneling problem. So with React, we had a very tight loop, right? This.setState, well, let's say like I typed into the input, that kicks off an event that goes into our event handler that calls setState. The setState updates the state and it kicks off a re-render, right? Pretty tight circle. What we're going to do with Redux is we're going to make that circle a little less tight, right? Like we're going to expand that circle. So what's going to happen is we're going to kick off an event. The event is going to call the handler. The handler is going to dispatch an action to Redux via an action creator, which is then going to get called into the reducer. The reducer is then going to modify its state. Once the state's been modified, it's going to notify React, which is a subscriber, which is then going to kick off a re-render, and then you have updated state at that point. So we've added like 3 or 4 more steps in there. So if that sounds more complicated, it is. So tough, I guess. So let's go ahead and get started with that then. First thing I want you to do is I want you to create a new file called reducers.js, lowercase r, and not JSX, just JS. We're not going to have any React living in here, so that's why we're not going to have any, there's no X on the end, and it's not a component, so it's not capital R. That's what that conventions, or those conventions mean.